So I think this is part 3 or 4 of the Kyosho Lazer ZXS Evolution restoration / rebuild series. This thing is a pain in the ass, and I will get into why. So I kind of anticipated this when I started the build, just based on images of what the car looks like when it's all done, and a lot of the let's say difficulty in building this out stems from how the gearboxes are put together. So, with a more conventional Lazer, which I do have, I'll just get one out here for reference for you guys. This one right here. So this was actually the very first Lazer build that I ever did. Let's put that there. Sorry, it's moving things around. So, gearboxes on this are relatively simple, right? You have a 2-piece gearbox here. This one's a little more complex in the rear. It's like a 3-piece unit with the brace that makes 4 pieces, I guess. But even though the servicing of the older version Lazers is a little complex, like if you want to get to the diffs, it still goes together okay because the gearboxes are actual casings. All right. Now let's fast forward to the ZXS. Let's get this guy out. Here, the front gearbox is kind of a case, but instead of being 2 pieces, it's 4. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, plus this Lex end piece in the middle. I think I spoke to this a little bit on the previous video, how challenging that can be to put together correctly. And then in the back here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces. And it's not really a casing. You have these 2 pieces on the bottom that house the bearings that mount the diff. And then you have these 2 plates here that kind of comprise the upper portion of the casing with a bunch of spacers to make sure everything's all spaced out correctly. This part is the difficult part. In part because of just the way that it's made, and also in part because of how the manual tells you to put it together, which in my personal opinion is not the best sequence to use to put this together. So what they essentially ask you to do is to build the top piece, so the carbon plate pieces, all at once, and then you mount that onto the bottom part here on the chassis. So you have these 2 screws here on either side that connect these plates to these bottom sort of quarters of the gearbox unit. Okay, fine. But what you find is you have to, put the diff in with the diff pulley on that goes to the rear, and you have to have the pulley attached for the front center pulley, and you're putting all these plates together and all these spacers together and all the roller bearings that hold the belts on. Doing it this way is extremely difficult if you don't have like 10 hands. So an easier way to do it, although it does require some like let's say disassembly and reassembly as you're going through the process, is to actually mount this plate here onto this right side lower gearbox unit, and that gives you something sort of to work against as you're putting in bearings and posts and everything, and you're just sort of building it out from here to here. At least this is held down somewhere. So that's point number 1. The other thing that I, let's say, didn't like about it was the actual roller bearings themselves. So you have one roller bearing here, the way the manual wants you to do it, and that one goes across the gearbox and holds down the left side belt. So basically you would have from this side a post with roller bearings that would go all the way across and would hold down this belt against this pulley. Okay, and then from this plate here, you'd have the same exact post that would come in from this side and hold up this rear belt, but from the bottom. You can kind of see it right there. Okay, but what that essentially means is, if you have, because those roller bearings are supposed to hold the belts down and keep them from skipping, that means you can't install those bearings first and then put the belts on. So you got to put the belt on first, then install the post, which means while you're still putting this right half together, you have to have some of the left pieces come in so you can put that post on. And by the way, because that's also going to get in the way of the rear belt, you got to put the rear belt in first, then this belt, then that post with the roller bearings, and then, by the way, the screw that holds this in, you can't access that screw with this motor plate in here. So none of this can be on. This whole motor plate, that goes out. And by the way, that's used to mount to these posts to connect to this side. So basically all this stuff's going to be like kind of loose as you're trying to assemble everything. And then putting in this left side plate with the post that holds up this rear belt from the bottom, you kind of have to like scoop the belt over that post because it really like pushes the belt up there. So what I figured was easier to do would be to essentially make a separate roller bearing setup that goes on the right hand side, this right half here, and screw it in to hold up the rear belt from the bottom here. That's a lot easier than trying to use the post from the left side and push it in, because that way I can put this in while this right plate is mounted onto this lower right half, and that's sort of in place. So as I'm putting the belt in, it's just easy to mount. Okay. And then, likewise for the other side, you can do the same. You kind of do the same thing. The problem with putting the post in on this side, going across to this belt, or I'd say one of the problems is it doesn't always align perfectly with the belt, because the belt tends to want to move around a little bit on the pulley. And so if it moves off to the right a little bit, so up in this direction, then it's not going to be aligned to the actual post, or sorry, the roller bearings. Right, here's the post itself. So the roller bearings would go in on this part of the shaft right here. If the belt moves, it's going to start rubbing against the post. So what you really want is enough margin on either side for the belt to wander a little bit and not rub up against any posts and cause any drivetrain losses. So since you can't accomplish that with that original post coming in from this side, you'd think, okay, well maybe I could put a screw in on this side, kind of like what I did for the other roller bearing or for the rear belt, and set something up over here. In principle, you can do that. The problem is the amount of margin you need to have sort of bearing space, if you will, for this belt, and then to put a lock nut on that side of the screw threading to hold it down. That lock nut's going to end up rubbing against this other belt. So basically, I just took out, I had foregone the top roller belt entirely. I don't think it's necessary. Given the experience I had with running YZ10s, it was really the rear belt that skipped more than the front belt. So I'm pretty confident, also given how tense this is right now before the top deck's even mounted, that we'll stretch it out a little more, that this will be perfectly fine. The only thing you really need a roller bearing for is this rear belt, and that's because the size of the belt here is actually larger than what you would use without a roller bearing. The belt is actually large, and then you use that roller bearing to sort of like scoop up the rest of the slack in the belt, and you get a lot of slack. So you could theoretically have a different rear belt that doesn't require you to use a roller bearing at all. A belt with fewer teeth. I don't know how many fewer teeth, but fewer teeth. And then you don't have to worry about the roller bearings at all. Fine. So what belts did I end up using for this? So I got both belts from Polybelt. This is a 3M 546 on the, oops, that just came off, for the front belt. And then on the rear, I used a 3M 174. So 174 millimeter total circumference on this one. And that one was what, 546? Yeah, 546. So this 546 actually lines up with the original belt for the ZXS Evo. I don't know why I had gotten a 576 earlier, which was like way too big for this. It's really 546. And then the rear one, I was playing around with a few different belt lengths to see what gives me the right amount of slack to wrap around that roller bearing that would go in there. So instead of a 174, if you want to avoid that roller bearing entirely, you need to pick up all that slack. You might be you know, I don't know, like a 144 or 147 or something like that. I don't know. I'd have to figure that out. But anyway, that's what I use for the belts. The other thing, by the way, since this just came off, because with these Lazer diff pulleys, there's like one part here that's supposed to snap onto the side. I think technically you have to glue that on. I haven't glued that on yet, so I got to do that. That just popped off of this side here, and that's why this belt all of a sudden became loose, because now the belt came off the pulley. So I got to deal with that later. Okay, so that is pretty much the set of challenges you'll have to deal with when assembling the rear gearbox. And this is why I think the older style ZX, ZXR, ZXRR is actually a lot easier to deal with, especially with the rear gearbox. And, you know, imagine for a moment if you need to rebuild this rear diff. Got to take it out, re-grease it, flip the diff plates, whatever. Well, what do? You could say you take off these 4 screws and then maybe a couple others, and you lift this whole thing up, and then you think, well, the belt would just drop out of the bottom of the, because you have this top half here that houses the bearings. The problem is you got to get the pulley out of there. So that means you have to take apart some of this to get the rear diff pulley out, right? Out from the belts and out from the bearing housings. On this type of a Lazer, it's way easier. So what you do is you take out basically these 4 screws here, and that allows you to take out this rear inner hinge pin mount so that you can free up the arms. And then you take these out, and then you take this screw out, and basically the whole rear assembly here whoosh, comes right off. And then there's 2 screws for this sort of bottom portion of the rear gearbox housing, and that comes out, and then the diff pulley comes right out. You don't have to disassemble any of this stuff up here. But because this plate here, this left side plate, is exactly symmetric with the right side plate, you can't just take off this bottom portion. You got to take off the whole thing. So there's more disassembly and reassembly required to service this rear diff. That's a big pain in the ass. Big pain in the ass. So, you know, of course I'm going to keep going with this build, but I just want to point that out that, you know, even though it's a beautiful car, it is not all that it seems from first glance. And by the way, because of the difficulty in building the gearboxes, that does have me thinking twice about whether this is something I want to run at the Vintage Off-Road Nationals, because, you know, you may find yourself having to repair something. And, you know, I generally like to have buggies that are not only competent dynamically, but also relatively easy to work on. So this does have me thinking of going back to the Inferno 10, which I have there. I'm kind of revisiting that and trying to fix up a few things. Or my YZ10, right? That's tried and true. So I'm going to maybe make a separate video on that later, talking about the four-wheel drive buggy options I have now, and how my thoughts have been revised from the last time I talked about what the best vintage four-wheel drive buggies are. But that's a separate topic. So anyway, what comes next here? I got a few more things to mount. I got to mount these screws on this side. And then I think I was doing a lot of this build completely out of order. So let's see. I got to do, shock towers, the rear shock tower setup with the sway bars, turnbuckles, yada yada, suspension arms. So I'll get to that later. So anyway, thanks for watching.